Hello, students. Mr. Young here. Welcome to Chapter 25, Lesson 4. Today's lesson is the Cold War. Almost all of the Cold War. So, there's a lot of subjects broken down into very simple parts, but I enjoy teaching it. So, what was the Cold War? The Cold War is essentially a competition between democracy and the free market versus communism. It lasted between 1945 and 1990. Basically, at the end of World War II, two superpowers emerged: the United States and the Soviet Union. So you had the United States, sort of the pinnacle of freedom and democracy, and then Russia, the Soviet Union, and they were pretty much the bulwark of communism. And both nations spread. They sought to influence the world, sort of politically and militarily. And so that competition between sort of the United States and the Soviet Union really dominated world politics for decades, from that whole time span, 45 to 90. It was called the Cold War because technically there was never like a giant war between the United States and the Soviet Union. So they called it the Cold War. Not so much a war as it was like a time period. But there were kind of small proxy wars. Proxy war not being an official vocab word for you, but a proxy war is kind of like when you have puppets fighting, like puppet states. For example, when we talk about the Korean War briefly, you had the Soviet sort of communist-backed North fighting the South, which was backed by the U.S. And same thing happened in Vietnam. So you had capitalism and democracy fighting communism. It just was never directly United States versus the Soviet Union. So that's what we'll have. We'll learn all about it today. Let's get into it. There's Uncle Sam representing the United States, and the Great Bear is what Russia was called. So, things got salty between the Soviets and, well, everyone before the Nazis were even defeated. How to split up post-war Germany was an issue. They ended up splitting Germany into 4 zones. One for the US, one for Britain, one for France, and one for Russia. Furthermore, the German capital of Berlin was in the Russian zone, so it was split into 4 sectors, with a British zone, an American zone, a French zone, and a Russian zone. Now, upon the ending of the war, Stalin was demanding high reparations from Germany, but U.S. President Truman, who had taken over when Roosevelt died, said no. I'm guessing he remembered what happened last time Germany was forced to pay high reparations. Now, the way it all ended up shaking out, you ended up having the Soviet Union in control of most of Eastern Europe, where they did not hold elections, and Stalin installed communist governments. Western Europe remained free democracies, so your France, your Britain, places like that, Spain, Belgium, Norway, places all like that. Western leaders like President Truman and Winston Churchill became worried about their commie former allies and their possible spreading of communism to more parts of Europe. Eastern Europe was essentially cut off from Western Europe in what they call the Iron Curtain. Right here, the Iron Curtain. See, there's Western Europe, they're good, and then the Iron Curtain and the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union and the United States are clearly not friends anymore. The common enemy, the Nazis, are gone. They have vastly different governments, and tensions are rising. U.S. diplomat George Kennan had this idea to halt communism while avoiding war. It was called containment. The idea was to contain communism by a number of means and not letting it spread any further. And this was by means of possibly militarily, but other means as well, non-military means. Truman adopted this policy of containment by 1947, and it was called the Truman Doctrine. So you hear the Truman Doctrine? The Truman Doctrine means don't let communism spread. Now, communism tends to crop up where there are bad economies and discontent, which there was plenty of because Europe was still ravaged by World War II. It had ended, but cities were destroyed, people were dead. So the U.S. didn't want these discontent, destroyed economies to adopt communism. So they came up with an economic aid package for Europe. It was called the Marshall Plan. Basically, after World War II, the United States helped Europe rebuild itself, in part because they just, it's bad for everyone when things are destroyed, but in part also to ensure communism didn't spread to those nations by helping them rebuild. Germany divided. So in 1948, the British, French, and American sectors of Germany were all united to create the West German Republic. The West thought it important for the future of Germany that it be united. The Soviets felt differently. They wanted Germany fractured because they feared that a united Germany would once more be a threat to the Soviet Union. In response to this unification, the Soviets blockaded all land routes into the free western sector of Berlin. So they united all the French, the British, the Americans united their sections of Germany. They also did this in Berlin. So now you have a section of basically Soviet-controlled Berlin and sort of Western-controlled Berlin. And the Soviets were mad about this unification happening, so they wouldn't let anything. They blocked all the land routes into that part of Berlin. No water, no land stuff could get in. So Britain and the United States literally had to airdrop supplies into that section of the city. Basically, they had to drop these supplies in by plane until the Soviets stopped their little hissy fit almost a year later. It was May 1949. Berlin, as did Germany, remained divided between the Soviets and Western powers. This little episode of history where the Soviets blocked it off like that is called the Berlin Airlift. You can read about it here. So the Soviets were a problem. They did not play well with others. In 1949, Canada, USA, and 10 other Western nations formed what could best be described as a military alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which is still around today. In 1955, West Germany was actually allowed to create an army, and they joined NATO. Naturally, the Soviets were not happy about this and created their own alliance called the Warsaw Pact. You can kind of see it here. You've got NATO countries, and then other allies of the U.S., and you've got the Warsaw Pact, and kind of basically red versus blue. Now, Joseph Stalin died in 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev took his place as leader of the Soviet Union. In 1961, Khrushchev demanded that the Western powers leave Berlin. If you look at a map, you see Berlin was in the whole communist sector. However, remember, it had been split. So Khrushchev wants all of Berlin now, but JFK, President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, basically told Khrushchev that wasn't going to happen, so Khrushchev went ahead and constructed the largest spite fence in history. You go spite fence like you have neighbors, they don't like you, so they build a fence so they don't have to look at you. Spite fence. That's kind of what Khrushchev did in Berlin. They built the Berlin Wall. Its purpose was to basically totally segregate their sector of Berlin from the other parts of Berlin, and there were armed guards on it, and they wouldn't let anyone escape. You could only get out of that sector of Berlin with permission. So mental note, students, if a place needs armed guards to keep you from running away, it's not a city you want to live in. In fact, it's more like a prison. But the Berlin Wall served as a symbol of the Cold War and maybe communist oppression for decades. I mean, this was the 50s, the Berlin Wall, or 61, sorry. The Soviet Union, the wall didn't fall till 1990, so it's 30 years. Now the arms race. People think of the arms race when they think of the Cold War. The constant tension between the USA and Russia, Soviet Union, led to an arms buildup, each side striving to have more and more and better weapons. Most dangerous of these was the nuclear arsenal. It is said that each side of the Cold War had enough nuclear missiles to destroy the world 100 times over. That's a lot of nukes. The nuclear tension really came to a head when JFK found out Russia was shipping nukes to Cuba, a Warsaw Pact nation just south of Florida. You know where Cuba is at. President Kennedy said no way, and he blockaded Cuba. And so now you have this blockaded Cuba and these Soviet ships sailing towards Cuba. And no one's sure what's going to happen. Is there going to be a nuclear apocalypse? This lasted for 5 days, and then the Soviet ships turned around and went back in exchange for essentially the promise, the pledge, that the United States would not invade communist Cuba. This here is the backbone of the nuclear arsenal, the Minuteman missile. Nuclear missile right there. Intercontinental ballistic missile. They're called ICBMs. Alright, during World War II, let's start with the head, the title. The Cold War in Asia. Here's how it went down in Asia. Kind of crazy. During World War II, the communists and nationalists in China combined forces to fight the Japanese. But once the Japanese were defeated, they no longer had that common enemy. And the nationalists and the communists ended up fighting each other. The nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, ended up moving to Taiwan to create their own nationalist government. And the communists, led by Mao Zedong, took over mainland China, and basically the two have been fighting over who has been, not those two specifically, but sort of Taiwan versus regular China have been kind of fighting about who should rule China ever since. So that's how the People's Republic of China, which stands today, was formed. Mao Zedong took over the mainland and created the People's Republic of China. In the 1950s, Mao and his government took over China's businesses and industry. As we learned with communism, that means that the government controls the land, labor, and capital, the factors of production. And that's what happened in China in the 50s. Now, one of those proxy wars we were talking about, the Korean War. So after World War II, the U.S. and Russia split Korea. The South was a U.S.-backed democracy, and the North was a Soviet-backed communist state. In 1950, the Northern communists invaded the democratic South. President Truman and the United Nations ended up sending troops to defend South Korea. There's a whole lot more detail to this, a whole lot of back and forth. So the North invades the South. They take over almost all the South. Then reinforcements from the UN arrive, and they push back up to the border, and then all the way up to the Yalu River, which is the North Korean-Chinese border. And everyone was like, all right, democracy wins. And then China got involved. And waves of Chinese army soldiers pushed back the United States and UN forces all the way back down at the 48th parallel, which the border had been before, where they basically fought to a stalemate for a few years before a ceasefire was made. And that's why Korea is still split today. You have the democratic South, where they're known to be very good video gamers. That's what I think of South Korea. The best gamers are from South Korea. And then the North Korea is still in the news because they're still a brutal communist dictatorship under Kim Jong-un, and he's crazy, and he's always talking about nuking the United States. So Korea is still split. That's why the Korean War. Why did we help in Korea? Remember the Truman Doctrine, containment. We were supposed to defend people from being taken over by communists and stop the spread of communism. You can see here's Korea as seen from space today. Free market South, crazy communist North. Yep. Alright, Japan. There's not actually a lot to be said about Japan. The U.S. occupied Japan. Oh, we're running out of time. From 1945 to 1952, Japan's military was greatly reduced. However, they adopted a new constitution and a Bill of Rights, and the U.S. invested billions into Japan. And, it worked for them. They had a booming economy by the 1970s, they were a world economic power again. Meanwhile, in the West, after World War II, thanks to the Marshall Plan, Europe rebounded economically. West Germany, so like the non-commie part of Germany, became the most prosperous nation in Europe. France manufactured aircraft, weapons, and cars. In Britain, the old industries like textiles were replaced with new service industries. In 1957, a number of Western European countries created a European Economic Community, sort of like an economic treaty. And this was kind of the first step in creating a united Europe. Now, sort of an initial European Union, if you will. Alright, over in the United States, the economy was blazing through the 50s and 90s, are mostly marked with civil rights movements. Guys like Martin Luther King, JFK, and President Johnson pushing through legislation to fight poverty and discrimination. 63, Equal Pay Act, made it illegal for women to be paid less than men for the same work. Times were changing. All right, 5 seconds left. Quiz on the next page. Good luck. Let me know if you need anything.